Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing an extra special tiered hex card. I love cards that have dimension to them, especially ones that fold flat to mail. This here is the Happy Easter letterpress and foil plate. Then we have the Confetti color layering stencils, and I'll be using that to add color to the large egg. Then we have our landscape die set, perfect for the borders for this card, as well as the Color My World Stamp and Cut and the Spring Tweetings Stamp and Cut. So you'll be using something from each one of these sets to create this card. And I'll be starting off with the Happy Easter letterpress and foil plate. So this plate can be used in both the letterpress system or BetterPress system, as well as the glimmer system. So you can hot foil with it, or you can use it in your BetterPress system with a variety of different inks and a variety of different cardstocks. I love press and foil plates because they have so much versatility to them. So I have some Hammermill cardstock that I'm taping to the clear plate of my BetterPress system. I have the Happy Easter plate, and I'm going to heat emboss that sentiment onto the Hammermill cardstock. You could just use an ink and have it flat, but I do really love the extra dimension that you get when you heat emboss. So I used a little bit of embossing powder tool on my cardstock to make sure that the embossing powder only sticks to the ink. I inked up my plate with some Versamark ink, put the clear plate on the base and put it through my die cutting machine to press that sentiment onto the Hammermill cardstock. Then I'm going to put some embossing powder on here, and I'm using some super fine gold embossing powder. Anytime I use BetterPress sentiments, I really like to use super fine embossing powder because it gives it a little bit more detail. Once I have it completely covered and I put all of that on top of some scrap paper so I can put the extra back in the container, I use my embossing tool to melt that embossing powder. Once that sentiment is embossed, I'm going to use the egg die from the set to die cut it into an egg. Now the letterpress and foil plate has 4 different options. There is a solid egg, the Happy Easter, the sentiment for foil and press plates. Then there are 2 different dies, and there's the egg die to die cut it out. Then there's also a die for the sentiment. Now, originally I was going to just use the embossed sentiment with the egg die, and I wasn't going to add anything else. In the end, I add an extra sentiment that is embossed and then die cut with the egg or with the sentiment die from this set, and I'll share why in just a moment. So once I have this die cut, I'm going to be using the Confetti color layering stencil in order to add some confetti color to this egg. So I put it on my sticky mat. I put the first stencil on there. Now this is a 6x6 stencil, but I want to make sure that I'm positioning them all the same, that there's the way that they're supposed to go. So I use a little bit of painter's tape in the top left corner and the bottom right corner. This just makes it much easier for layering the different layers. I wanted to use interference inks for this just because of their shimmer. If you don't have interference inks, just a dye-based ink would easily work here, and you can just get that color to it. But I thought, especially for Easter, especially for a fun, interactive, dimensional card, that the interference inks would be nice. So I started off with Summer Garden. Then I'm going to go in with Opal Blush for the next layer. And if you've never seen interference pads, they're like magic pads to me. They are a pad that has one look on white or light cardstock and a completely different look on black or dark cardstock, which is why you see 2 colors on the cover of that pad. I have a whole playlist just with videos where I've used interference inks in them. So if you'd like to learn more or see different techniques used with them, I share them all on that playlist. So here I'm only using it for the color that shows up on white or light cardstock and that shimmer property that it has. And this one here is a Lilac Meadow. The last one was Pink Champagne. So this Lilac Meadow, it shows that purple, but when you tilt it into the light, you'll see that green shimmer that this particular pad has. One moment, I got ahead of myself. This one here is that Pink Champagne. So the Pink Champagne has a beautiful pink color, but you can see there's a little bit of green on the pad or the top, the lid of that pad. When you tilt this one into the light, you get a bit of a green shimmer to it. So it's just a fun ink to play with. I love coordinating or playing with these in many different ways. And I also love using them with my distress inks with stenciling to get a combination of just that dye-based ink in some areas and the shimmer finish in others. Now, once I had stenciled on that egg, I realized that the sentiment really got lost in there. So off screen, I did the same thing as I did with my first sentiment. I used some Hammermill cardstock, heat embossed that sentiment on there using the BetterPress system with the same plate that I used for that first sentiment. But this time I'm die cutting it with the sentiment die that comes in that set. I'm going to lay this on top of that egg so that there's an outline around the sentiment just to make it pop a little bit more. So here I put it on there with white or with just no ink just to see how much it popped. And it was definitely better than without that die cut, but I thought it would look much better if there was ink blending around it just to really make that sentiment pop. So I went and I used the Lilac Meadow Interference ink to do some ink blending around that sentiment, and that ink doesn't stick to the embossing. It only inks, or it only sticks to the cardstock around it. But that does give the sentiment an outline, a completely different color from the background, and helps it to pop a little bit more. Now, because I used Hammermill cardstock for this egg, I added another layer of that egg die cut behind it just to give it a little bit more stability. Because this card has a lot of dimension and that dimension kind of has to stand on its own, and this egg is fairly large, I wanted to make sure that it was going to stand up nice and straight, that it wasn't going to start to curve and bend from the weight of standing on its own, because it's only going to be glued at the bottom. The rest of it is going to be freestanding. Once I have that egg done, and you can see how the Happy Easter now stands out a lot better. You still get that really fun speckle on the egg, but it does stand out a lot more than it did before adding that extra layer. I can set that to the side and I can start on my different images. So I'm going to be using images from both the Color My World Stampin' Cut and the Spring Tweetings Stampin' Cut. I'm going to be using all of the different bunnies in there, as well as the different chicks from the Spring Tweetings. And then there's also some eggs in there. I'm going to stamp them with black Memento ink, and I'm going to color them with Copic markers. Now, these are two brand new sets that I have not used before. So the very first thing that I do anytime I have new stamp sets, clear ones, is I use a white eraser on top of the stamping surface. It removes any possible manufacturing residue, and it helps the stamps take ink just a little bit better. It only needs to be done the very first time you use a set, and anytime I open a set, I do the entire set. So I know if I've used one stamp, I've done that entire set. It doesn't need to be done again. Once I've used that white eraser, I use a soft brush to remove any possible eraser bits from there. But this just helps that stamp to take ink just a little bit better. It kind of conditions it a little bit. Then I position it on my cardstock here, and I'm using Hammermill. I like to use this for both ink blending as well as Copic coloring. I position my stamps on here, and I'm going to stamp them all at one time. So I have the stamps from both different sets here that I'm putting on there. There's 3 different eggs, 4 chicks, I think there was 6 bunnies, and then there's a little paintbrush that I'm going to be using for one of the bunnies to hold. Now, there are more pieces to each one of these sets than I'm using in this card. I just didn't want to overwhelm and have too much clutter at the bottom. I will be doing another video with this collection where I'm just creating some A2 cards with this, but I've wanted to create one of these hex cards for so long, and I just thought this was the perfect collection to do that, to add that dimension and create a fun 3D card. So I had to get this done before I went and did the A2 cards because I was so excited about it. So like I said, you can add more to this, but you don't want the bottom to get too cluttered. You want to be able to see all these individual pieces on there. So once I have them stamped, I clean off my stamp set, and I just use a damp microfiber cloth to clean that stamp set off because it's just dye-based ink. To start off with, I'm going to color in the bunny ear. So that was R11 for the Copic markers. I'm using Copic markers here. Any alcohol marker would work here. You just pick and choose which colors you prefer. This is E35 and E33. I'm going to be using them for the bunnies. I will be using the light color first, going in with the dark color and putting the shading where I want it, and then going back in with that light color. And I'm just using very simple alcohol ink marker blending here. Some people definitely prefer to do the dark color first and then just go over it with the light color. This is the way I learned, this is the way I'm familiar with it, and this is the way I just keep doing it out of habit. I keep meaning to try the other way, or I've tried it, but I keep meaning to try doing it more often to see if I prefer that way better. But like I said, sometimes you get into a habit and it's just the way you've always done it. And it's sometimes hard to get out of that. Now, like I was going to say, is I am coloring with these with Copic markers. If you prefer dye-based markers, you can color them with your dye-based markers. That will work. You don't have to do Copic marker coloring for this. Another option would be to watercolor these pieces. These all have coordinating dyes with them. So once I'm done coloring them, I will be cutting them out with the coordinating dyes. So they'll be perfect for the card. So you can color them however you want. Another option would be Prismacolor pencils. There's not one way to color them for this card. I just decided that I wanted to do some Copic marker coloring this day, so that's what I ended up choosing. I actually sat there for a while deciding which one I really wanted to do most, and they were pretty evenly matched, but I hadn't done alcohol marker coloring in just a little bit, so I opted to go with that option. So I'm going to color all of the bunnies in exactly the same way, using the light E33 first, going over it with the E35, the darker of the browns, and then going back over with E33. Now I'm using two colors when I'm doing my shading for this one. If you want, you can do three colors to get more visual dimension to it. Because there's so much to this card, I didn't really think it needed it, so I opted to go just the simpler route and just do two colors per area that I thought needed a little bit of extra visual dimension. You could even just use one color and just color it flat, but I do think that extra color, that little bit of shading, just adds a little bit more detail to each one of these bunnies. Now, like I mentioned before, you can color it however you want with a different method if you want. I would definitely be changing the ink or the paper depending on which is better for the method that you're wanting to color it with. For instance, I wouldn't be using Hammermill Cardstock and Memento ink if I wanted to watercolor these. I would go and use a permanent ink and then watercolor cardstock, or I would be heat embossing the images and then using watercolor cardstock before I even went to watercolor them. So if you do decide to change the way you color these pieces, totally fine. Just make sure to alter which ink you use to suit that, as well as which paper, which cardstock to use. After I have those bunnies done, I'm going to be doing the chicks. So I have Y02 and Y06. When I pick colors for, especially for a beginner or simple alcohol ink blending, I typically will use colors that are 2 to 3 numbers apart. This makes it easier to do that coloring. It makes sure that those colors aren't too far apart to accomplish that blending. However, once you're used to it, once you've done it a little bit, once you've become familiar with it, you absolutely can break those rules, and I absolutely have. It's just the easiest rule to learn or to follow when you're starting out. So just like the browns, I started with the light yellow, went with the dark yellow, and then went back over with the light yellow. I have a YR04 here that I'm just using to put a little bit of orange for the chick's mouth. I grabbed one of those browns again for the handle for that paintbrush. And then I have two blues here that I'm going to be coloring the eggs with. So I have BOO and BO2. I'm going to use that little bit of BO2 for the tip of that paintbrush as well. Same with the bunnies and the chicks. I'm going to go in with BOO, the light one first. Then I'm going to go in with the darker color where I want shading, and then back in with that lighter color to blend it all together. And when you're doing Copic color blending, when you first do it, it doesn't necessarily look really well blended, but that color continues to mix and blend while it's dry. One of my reasons for Copics being one of my favorite ways to color is it's a little bit more forgivable. There is a learning curve to it. It takes a little bit to get used to it. But if this dries and I don't really like that blending, I can go back over it again. Or I don't even have to wait for it to dry. If I'm not liking the way it's looking, I can keep going over and adding more ink and blending it a little bit more. So once I have these done, I'm ready to start die cutting those pieces. So I'm going to match the dies that go with each one of these. I'm using a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape in order to tape them in place. I want to make sure that those dies don't move on me. The one rule when die cutting a bunch of pieces like this, make sure your dies are separate. You don't want them overlapped, because if they are overlapping each other, you're going to ruin your dies. So we want to make sure that there's some space between each one of those die sets. Doesn't matter if we need to do it in 2 or 3 steps. You want to make sure to stay safe with those dies and have them apart. So once I have all of these pieces done, I will typically wait till I am done my card to add stickles or glossy accents, but I'm going to do that now so that they can sit aside and dry while I'm working on the rest of my card. And the main reason for this is I want to be putting some glossy accents on the tip of the bunny's nose as well as the chick's beak. I'm also going to put glossy accents on that solid egg that doesn't have pattern to it. I want to give it a chance to dry before assembling my card, especially that egg. When I go to put it on that card, if it's not sitting quite flat and I go to put glossy accents on it, that glossy accents tends to follow gravity. So I want to make sure that it's on a nice flat surface while it dries. Now, for the eggs or for the tips of the noses and the beaks of the chicks, those dots of glossy accents will take maybe 10 minutes to dry max. For that egg, it's going to take quite a bit longer because there's obviously a lot more there. So I want to give it probably a good hour for that to dry before I use it on the card. The rest of them, I don't have to worry quite as much, but I do want to make sure that that egg there is completely dry. So for the base of my card, I have a 6x6 piece of Breeze cardstock here. You could use white cardstock and then completely ink blend it, but I started with a light blue color. I'm using a little bit of Uncharted Mariner Distress ink in order to ink blend around that. This is the step that you could eliminate if you want, but I do think it frames it in really nicely. I have 3 different shades of greens for the bottom of my card. So they are cut to different dimensions, and I will list the dimensions in the description as well. That bottom one there is Peridot Cardstock, and it is trimmed to 1 1/4 inches by 7 inches. The middle one is Rainforest Cardstock, and it is trimmed to 1 1/2 inches by 6 inches. And the top one is Fern Cardstock, and it is trimmed to 1 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So I did a little bit of ink blending on, especially the 2 lower ones, with some peeled paint distress ink, just to give them a little bit of visual dimension. And then I'm going to be using the grass edge from the landscape die set. I want to create some grass for those bunnies and chicks to sit in on the bottom of the card. So for the first 2, that die will cover or will go all the way across them. So I'm just laying them on the cardstock and running it through. For the first one, I think for the second one, I needed to use a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape in order to tape that in place. I want to make sure that it cuts it properly and doesn't move on me. When I went and put it this way, it just kept wanting to move on me while I was putting that plate down. So I end up taping it in place just to make sure that it sits exactly where I want it to go and it doesn't move. This is the easiest way to make sure things are being die cut exactly how you want. Sometimes with the curve of the plate, sometimes the blade or the die starts to curve a little bit and it just ends up moving on you or just doesn't sit quite right. It's easiest to tape it in place. So for the last piece there, because it's longer than the die, what I'm doing is I'm putting it along one edge. Once I have that first cut done, I'm going to take that die off. I'm going to lay it back down on the area that is not cut, trying to line up those grass pieces. Now, because it's grass, it's fairly forgivable. If it doesn't cut exactly how I want, I can always use some detailed scissors in order to trim it just a little bit, just to neaten it up a little bit. Another option, depending on where it is to put one of my little die cut bunnies or chicks or eggs in front of an area that I don't exactly like perfectly. So once I have those pieces cut, I can start to do my scoring. Now my measurements for my card base as well as my scoring lines are from another video I saw using a tiered hexagon card. If I find that video back, I will link it in the description below because she has several different ways of doing this card or different versions of the card. I didn't write down who it was. I just wrote down the measurements. But again, if I find it, I will link it in the box below so that you can get more inspiration for this card. This first piece here, the Peridot Cardstock, I scored it at 1/2 inch, 2 inches, 5 inches, and 6 1/2 inches. And once those were scored, I folded those score lines to make sure that I had a nice crisp score there. For the second one, the Rainforest Cardstock, I scored it at 1/2 inch, 1 1/2 inches, 4 1/2 inches, and 5 1/2 inches. So I'm using a score pal here. It makes it easiest for doing that scoring. You want to make sure that you have nice crisp score lines when they're done. It's just going to give the finished card a lot nicer look. This last piece here, the Fern Cardstock, I am scoring it at 1/2 inch, 1 inch, 4 inches, and 4.5 inches. And again, I will list those measurements in the description below so that you know, or so that you don't have to remember them or try to jot them down really quickly. I know sometimes when you have a lot of measurements at one time, it can get a little bit confusing. So I'll list them down there. So once I have these 3 pieces done, these are going to be the base of my card that I'm going to be sticking those bunnies and the chicks and the egg to. I'm ready to score the back of my card. So the back of my card here, this is the 6x6 inch Breeze cardstock. I am scoring it at 1.5 inches and 4.5 inches. So it's best if you have a scoreboard for this. It just makes it so much easier. I use mine a lot, so they're definitely well worth having a scoreboard that you can get some really nice scoring with. So once I have those pieces ready, I'm ready to do the base of my card. So I'm going to start with that Fern cardstock piece there. That's the smallest one. I'm adding a little bit of glue to the outside 1/2 inch score mark. Before I do that though, I took a pair of detailed scissors and I just trimmed off my little 1/2 inch tabs. I want to make sure that when it's glued down, I don't see the grass little spikes behind it. Just personal preference. And then I lay it on the bottom of that card. Now the inner score marks will be matching the score marks on the background of the card. So that is how I lined them up. Then I put my acrylic block on top of them to hold it in place while I work on the next layer. So the next layer, once again, I'm going to be putting glue on that 1/2 inch piece, making sure to trim those pieces, those tabs down so that they don't have grass showing behind them once it's glued down. And as with most of my cards, I like to use a liquid glue. It gives you that little bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place. You could use a double-sided tape here, but then you're a little bit limited. You have to make sure that you put it down perfectly the first time. That liquid glue gives you that bit of wiggle room. I'm lining each one of these pieces up with the bottom of the card so that when we tip the card up and it is vertical, it stands up nice and straight. So these pieces, every single one of them are lined up with that bottom of the card, and they just kind of keep going outside of each other. So the last piece there, the Peridot one, I once again use my detail scissors to trim that outside tab just a little bit, then use my glue on there and then glued it down and put an acrylic block on that, or on each one of those, just to make sure that it was holding it down nice and flat while that glue dried. Now that the card base is done, I'm ready to start adding the different pieces. So I'm going to start with my big egg in the back. Now, my vision for this card was to keep the top of this card completely exposed and open. In the end, I changed my mind. If you decide at the beginning that you want to have everything closed in like I do at the end of the video, you can add that top layer at this or before adding these pieces in. I do actually think it's probably easier to add it at the end, simply because you're not fighting with it with the little or the big egg in the center of the card when you're adding that to it. Now, when I'm adding these pieces on the base of the card, I keep adding some liquid glue to the top of those pieces. It doesn't need glue at the top. What you don't necessarily see while I'm doing that is even though I add the glue to the top of it, before I put it down, I swipe it off. So it's not gluing to the background of the card, but for some reason, I couldn't remember that while I was doing that. So just know when you're gluing these down, you only need to add the glue to the bottom part of that die cut, the part that is gluing to the grass piece. The pieces that are right in front of that big egg, those ones don't matter if you put some glue on the top of them, but for the ones at the bottom, you definitely only need glue at the bottom. So I do leave this layered up or lifted up a little bit while it's drying so that I accidentally don't glue one of those pieces to the base of my card by flattening it. So as I'm putting them together, I'm trying to pay attention to which way the bunnies and the chicks are facing. I want to make sure that I like them to face the inside of the card to focus on that big egg. It doesn't always work because sometimes you have a little bit more facing one way than the other way. I also like to disperse my eggs evenly around the front of the card so that they kind of just has an even look to it, as well as my bunnies and chicks. I like to make sure that they're kind of evenly dispersed, and then I'll add the chicks in the center because they do add a pop of color to it. Once I have all of those pieces done, I can let that dry for just a few moments. If by chance I had some glue at the top of one of those bunnies and chicks, I want to make sure that that dries completely before I lay my card flat. So this is the point where I thought I was done. I wanted to keep that top of that card open and just have a nice little scene here. The more I looked at it though, the more I felt it needed to, I needed to fill in the bottom of the card just a little, or the top of the card just a little bit. It needed to frame it in a little bit, but you can leave it at this point. You don't have to add any more if you don't want to. Another option would be to stencil or say add clouds to the background if you wanted to have a little bit more detail there. Now, what I ended up choosing to do was I took a piece of Hammermill Cardstock. I trimmed it to 7 inches, so that's the same length as my Peridot Cardstock at the bottom. I don't have a cloud border die, so I used my Tunnel Clouds die set. I used the largest one from that, and I cut up to one point of it so that I was kind of creating my own cloud border here. Now, my piece of Hammermill Cardstock here is like 5.5 inches wide. It doesn't need to be that width. I would say probably about 3 inches wide would be enough because we're just creating that border for the top. The rest of it isn't going to go to waste. I'll use them for sentiments and for die cutting other little pieces for my cards. So it's not going to go to waste anyways, but knowing ahead of time how wide you want it to be is probably going to be helpful, and you don't need to add that extra or have that extra little bit of cardstock here on your die cutting machine to die cut into, because it is going to be die cutting the top of that die towards the border that we're trying to create, as well as the bottom of it. So when I put them in the second time, I did match one of the corners of the clouds, or one of the points of the clouds, to where I had stopped die cutting the last die cut piece. Then I can take this out of here. There is a little tab on there that didn't quite cut through, so I'm going to be using my detail scissors in order to trim that down to make sure that we have a nice even cloud border here. And this is probably actually better than having a cloud border because it's completely uneven throughout the whole thing. So I just did white Hammermill cardstock. You could do a thicker cardstock if you want. I wanted to do a little bit of ink blending on here with some lost shadow distressing, just to add a little bit of that visual dimension. So I'm going to do that at the top and the bottom of the clouds, a little bit heavier on the bottom of the clouds for that shadow. I typically am. I chose the lost shadow because it's a really, really light pale gray. I don't want to make gray clouds here, but I do want to give them that little bit of visual dimension. Now, I don't need to do the two sides because we are going to add that 1/2 inch score line on the sides. It's going to be folded back, so we're not going to see it. I put my brush there and realized right away that I didn't actually need that because it was going to be hidden. But it's, again, sometimes habit just kind of does its thing. So I score this at the 1/2 inch mark, the 2 inch mark, the 5 inch mark, and then the 6.5 inch mark. This is exactly the same as the long border along the bottom, the Peridot one. That scoring is the same. Now, another option here would be to do 3 pieces similar to the way that there's 3 pieces at the bottom and layer those clouds behind there. I opted not to do that because I only wanted to have the look of the clouds to frame in the top of the card. And I also worried that adding extra layers on the inside of the card would interfere with the egg sitting there. So I just wanted to frame around the outside. But just know that if you're going to do this card with a different theme, you can use 3 tiers to the top piece, just like there's 3 tiers on the bottom if you want to have that detail to it. And some cards are going to be, that's going to be suitable for, and some that's not going to be suitable for. My point of these clouds here is just to kind of frame in the top and fill in part of that sky. And that's what this 1 tier does. I don't think adding extra tiers for this would accomplish that or make it any better. So once I have this done, just like the grass, I cut those tabs a little at an angle so that we didn't see a little bit of cloud at the top. For the one that I ended up grabbing my scissors and doing a little bit more, I realized that I hadn't done it quite as much as I needed to. So I used that, or I've used those detail scissors to trim that down just a little bit more. Now, while those 2 tabs are drying, I'm going to add a little bit of stickles here. I always love adding stickles for a little bit of glitter. I'm using some Stardust here, and it's just going to add just a touch of shimmer to the edges of those clouds. It's not going to add any color to it, and that's one of the reasons why I love using this one, because it doesn't add the color. It just adds that little bit of sparkle, that little bit of texture, that little bit of something to catch the light. So again, just like the bunnies, because I'm not using a lot, and I did use some stickles on some of the details of the bunnies and just realized I forgot to, some of the details on the little eggs, and I realized that I forgot to mention that. Just like the glossy accents on the bunny noses and beaks, I don't need to wait for this to dry a long time. So I think I waited maybe 15 minutes and then this card is done. And I do think that cloud part at the top definitely frames it in at the top. Again, that is a piece that you could omit if you wanted to. You don't need to have it there, but I do think it frames it in nicely. And once again, this folds down perfectly flat. This is a 6x6 card, so you would need an envelope for a 6x6 card. But they're fun ones to do, ones that can fold flat so you can easily mail them. They're not going to cost you a ton in postage because they're flat, but they have so much dimension to them because they pop out and have those different tiers to them. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.